Welcome to Talk Retail to Me, where we unpack real-world retail challenges and the strategies that solve them. In today's episode, we're diving into how Parker Avery partnered with a major theme park retailer to untangle the complexities of managing nearly 300 unique stores. From hyper-localized assortments to fluctuating margins, you'll hear how data, analytics, and a clear roadmap help balance guest satisfaction with operational efficiency. Good day, everybody. Today I have with me Marty Anderson, who's a principal at Parker Avery, and Mike Johnson, a senior manager, both of whom worked on the project that we're going to talk about today. And I'm just going to toss it out to you guys to do some introductions. Marty, you want to go first?
Sure. As Tricia said, I'm a principal with Parker Avery Group. I've been in retail for around 30 years or so. The last 7 of those with the Parker Avery Group, almost 8. And my focus is usually on end-to-end merchandising and planning, processes, systems, and implementations.
My name is Mike Johnson. Also spent a lot of time in industry on the merchandise planning, allocation, replenishment, end-to-end processes for 25 to 30 years before joining Parker Avery. Been here about 5 with a focus similar to Marty's, really on end-to-end process, planning, allocation, inventory management.
Thank you. And I am Tricia Gustin. I lead the marketing efforts for the Parker Avery Group. So thanks for joining us on Talk Retail to Me. Let's jump into this client project. Tell us about the client, and then what are the challenges that they wanted us to help them solve?
So it was a large theme park-based client with millions of customers annually visiting their parks and the stores inside the parks and the products. And so that was really our focus, was these on-site stores. They were really looking for help reviewing their end-to-end management processes around how they were managing inventory, how they were determining productivity, how they were setting targets, and driving that from the point of plan and inception all the way to execution to understand where maybe they were turning too fast, not fast enough. How did they understand if their assortment was too broad or too deep? So everything related to inventory from the beginning all the way to putting it in the customer's hands.
I think one of the challenging aspects with a business like this is what's that balance between customer satisfaction, never wanting to disappoint, and from a inventory management aspect, that's like you never want to be out. But how does that parlay into being responsible with the biggest investment you have as a seller of goods is your inventory? So finding that balance was really important to them, and to understand, what can we do? And we need help with managing that inventory without disappointing the guests.
And remind me, how many stores are we talking about, and where was the geographic spread?
The geographic spread was national. They're definitely bi-coastal and have parks kind of everywhere, but the internal park stores, I want to say it was around 300 or so stores in total, but they definitely managed them in chunks by park location. So that was a little different because the customer bases, depending on where they were, East Coast, West Coast, could be a little different depending on theme, the type of customers that come, whether how much international versus local versus national travel. So there were a lot of variety of customers coming in and how that affected the product as well. Kind of like Mike was saying, it was fairly complex in that sense to understand. They definitely had different drivers for velocity of their products and the customer base they were trying to please.
One of the other challenges that they have is with the number of locations Marty mentioned, every single one of them is different. Every single one of them has a different assortment. Some of the items are only in one location. So it really adds to the complexity around managing inventory levels when you're a centralized procurement process, but you have to meet the needs of all these very, very unique selling locations. It's just a very different problem than you see in a lot of other retail operations.
Yeah, I think that's important to call out in that when you're dealing with a theme park, which is very different than just a general merchandise store out in public where everybody kind of comes down, when you're looking at those assortments, like Mike was saying, there's usually a lot of stores that carry the full range of products, or at least a substantial percentage of those ranges. When you're in something like a theme park, a lot of the locations within the theme park are very specialized or theme related based on the attraction that's nearest to their location. As you walk through a park, you'll probably know, if you've ever been to one, that the different locations as you walk through get more specific to whatever either rides or attractions are close to that store. And so the themes can change as you manage your way through the park. And maybe there are some flagships that carry the predominant assortment, but even in those, they might be missing some of the very specialized theme pieces. So when you're looking at things like how broad does your assortment need to be versus how deep, or what does productivity look like, and is it appropriate? To Mike's point, normally we would look at, say, you're doing long tail analysis, or you're looking at how much volume each item is making. But when you're only buying that item or collection of items for just a couple of stores, that becomes harder and harder to nail down when you have a really broad assortment in total, but each item is very specialized for its location. So how you look at it kind of has to be different than maybe how I would approach it in a more generalized retailer. And that was the biggest, earliest challenge I think we both kind of picked up on, is that the way we would normally approach it, we have to rethink and change a little bit, which is I think why they were struggling a little bit too, is like, how do we do a better job of evaluating and managing both our assortment and the depth of that assortment to make sure that we don't put ourselves in an inventory risk situation and get the most out of it. So we had to come up with a few new tricks.
All right. Well, speaking of tricks, let's talk about the approach you used to help them solve these challenges.
Well, as you might expect, our first step was interviewing their key business leaders across planning, IT, as well as operations, both DC and store operations, to understand their current processes, their tool sets, the configuration of those tools, as well as understanding the organizational structure that's supporting those. We also utilized our merchandising analytics toolkit to build out some data-driven dashboards to help us analyze and visualize their inventory productivity. And while we were doing the interviewing, we were also building these dashboards and tool sets in parallel so that we could then do our own analysis and come back with some meaningful recommendations. So when I was just talking about the differentiators and the challenges, we had to do some tweaks to those dashboards to make sure that how we looked at it was useful and effective based on the limitations of their assortment, like we talked about.
Yeah, I would just add that data was critical to this process. I mean, data is always critical, but to this process, having that really granular location level data really made a difference in how we were able to look at, the inventory performance in these locations on these very, very specific assortments. Because typically the clustering and way you would look at selling locations in a normal business just didn't apply. And like Marty said, had to get really creative with how do you replicate this long tail analysis to understand your top and bottom performing items when they're in a single location. So the amount of data that we were able to leverage and to get creative with how to analyze and distribute that data in such a way that we could understand and make meaningful conversations that the teams could actually review and understand when given this amount of data.
Something else that we did that I think if I were just doing typical high level inventory recommendations or something that was unique is we actually participated in on-site walkthroughs too of both the DCs as well as the actual parks and their stores. And I'm sure Mike probably feels the same way. We talked about it a lot. That was very eye-opening to me. And I think what I didn't know as we started the project was more critical for this scenario than if I were just going into a department store. I've been into tons of those. I understand how those work, or even a specialty store, because the capacity of these stores are so limited. And the issues relative to inventory that an on-site location is having or the DC is having tended to be very different than, say, people who were planning and buying the product. So if you looked at your overall ownership and felt like, no, we're in scope, but when you looked at how much of it was being forced in or through those locations at a single time, the limitations there were quite eye-opening. The benefit, I guess, of that location is their DCs are either on-site or within an hour, say, of the park. So they're getting daily deliveries. Some of the bigger locations even multiple times a day. And so they're fulfilling as the customer is buying because there are no back rooms. There's no place to stock things. If you've ever been in a theme park, the stores are teeny tiny. Sometimes there's just enough room for the customers to weave their way through and get out. There's not much of a back room to say. And so having that targeted understanding of how much do I need to carry at any given time relative to sales, relative to presentation quantity so that we look robust and full versus how much am I carrying in the DC and is that too much or too little? It really changes what productivity likes because you can't just look at it at the total. We had to oscillate between looking at the total company productivity and what that implication was on their overall financial plan and profitability, as well as the individual location productivity to understand, are we overstressing the people in those locations and can they keep up? They were spending a lot of extra expenses to have extra people on site to just juggle inventory because they were too loaded. So even if the total was in line, the piece that was in store sometimes was too heavy. It could be vice versa. So
Yeah.
That was something else that I think added a lot of value, actually.
Totally agree, Marty. I think that one of the things that became very evident as we walked through the various locations is the inventory turns very, very quickly. And that is a good problem to have in most situations. But from an operational standpoint, it was very, very difficult to manage. Again, if you go back to one of the core principles of never wanting to disappoint the guest, the implications to inventory of that is that there's typically carrying far more stock just in case, not wanting to miss that one sale, and having to walk through that and see that and walk through it with some of the teams that manage inventory at the same time was really eye-opening to understand what the implications of that extra stock have on the operational way to manage it.
So I was going to ask you if you got to go into the theme parks and see the stores. I figured you did, but definitely seeing things live in action makes a huge difference, like you guys are saying. So I'm glad that happened. So I wouldn't call that a roadblock necessarily. I think it enhanced the ability of y'all to deliver the recommendations because of that on-site knowledge. Were there any issues or roadblocks that you encountered during the project? And if so, how did you overcome them?
There were only two that really stood out to me. The first was what we've already talked about, is the overall complexity and nature of the theme park business, where it's hyper localized. Mm-hmm. And people talk about localized assortments all the time, but in a theme park, they're hyper localized. Like Mike was saying, there could be an item that's only in 2 locations or in 1 location. And so that was the first thing that we had to get our arms around and make sure that how we were looking at it and presenting it was fair, made sense, and we weren't kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because that item might be very important for a particular theme or location. And so we had to navigate that carefully. The other one, I think, for me, was because in a park-based business like this, they're predominantly a full price location or store or selling strategy. They don't really do a lot of promotions. They certainly don't do on-site markdowns. All liquidation is basically off-site. So normally in a traditional retail, if something starts slowing down, you might promote it. Or when it's end of life, you're not going to liquidate it. And even though that's on location, it also can be a traffic driver. Who doesn't run out to a store when they're having a sale? And so that can actually be a traffic driver to help send volume. They don't have that opportunity within a park. It's predominantly regular price, and all of their liquidation is off-site. And so you don't have access to the full range of levers to pull that you would in just a traditional retail environment. And so as we were building strategies and thinking about what would help them, whether you call it a roadblock or just another challenge, it's a different way to have to think about it, to say, okay, these levers are no longer available to me. Now, how do I look at this business? Because how I plan and manage that inventory has to be even more precise, because I don't have the ability to just drive additional traffic with that lever. I have to leave price where it is for the most part. And to some degree, we did challenge them about maybe doing more promotion. There was an opportunity to do some, maybe not in a grand scale, but there was an opportunity to do some of that. And then also looking at how they were managing the liquidation offsite as well, which we did also get to go visit, which was really eye-opening. And so we did have to look at their liquidation offsite processes as well.
No, I agree with you on that, Marty. Those 2 points certainly were challenges. Roadblocks is a strong word, but I think it does characterize some difficulty that you would have in implementing change there. Really, just to add on to that piece, I think it's a guest-pleasing culture. That is the top of the totem pole. That is all that matters. So having those discussions of when you begin to utilize that data to tell the story of here's what it costs to carry this extra inventory just in case, it's a cultural shift. It's a mindset change that is in a very embedded culture of not disappointing anybody ever. So I think that makes it for tough conversations. But one of the things that I think supports that is it's not an anecdotal statement that you can say and they're going to believe it. The data has got to prove it out. And I think that was one of the key ways to address the roadblock around that. And other than that, I think that the points Marty made, I would agree with 100%.
Well said. I think the cultural thing was big.
I want to circle back to the approach. So you started off with a lot of interviews, as almost every single one of our projects is, to understand the current environment. And then you did a lot of store walks, DC walks. What happened next? You took all that information and the magic behind the scenes. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, really putting the story together at that point, pulling those pieces together that they could relate to and telling that story. So from beginning, here's how you start to plan your assortment, and here's where there might be gaps or opportunities, and what that looks like, and how much that can contribute to the overall improvement or enhancement of the process. And then taking that all the way down to the operational level to say, once you have the right amount, let's talk about controls and how that looks from an operational standpoint, and what you can do, what levers you have available, and what you do to make sure that we're not giving away some of the margin we're picking up in operational expenses because we're not managing efficiently on the back end. And so being able to kind of plot that storyline out and think of it as the life of an item or the life of a plan from conception down through execution, really building that story out for them and bucketing it in their journey along the way in a way that was understandable, I think was really important to tell that story, the journey all the way through. Whereas sometimes in another retailing client, we might have stopped at just the planning component, like get your total inventory right. You're going to have all these tools and they'll make sure that you get into the stores. But like Mike was talking about, their cultural perspective, we have to overbuy or overstock to make sure that every single customer gets a t-shirt or whatever it is, that not one person walks away unhappy, which is not a philosophy that average retailers, you want to sell out, right? That's how you avoid some of that liquidation risk. And so being able to effectively tell that story and show them examples of where that wasn't really working out for them from a profitability or a productivity standpoint and getting them to buy into it was really critical, I think. That was probably a big hurdle that we had to make sure that we were being judicious and really thoughtful about and planful about.
I think to kind of tie into what you're saying on that, Marty, is the need to rationalize the assortment to some degree. Historically, their assortments were really based on replacing volume or replacing whatever was in the assortment last year, or last 2 years, or whatever the breakout is. But really changing the mindset to some analytics around location SKU performance and understanding if this is important to my assortment, this is what its actual performance is and what it's going to cost. And having that data to back up what Marty was talking about, I think was very important.
What were the key deliverables?
The key to deliverables were providing them with some targeting mechanisms for how to determine the productivity and health of their overall inventory planning and positioning, some comparative analysis to industry of what should their targets be, what should the goals be overall. I think the analytics that Mike was just talking about, doing some inventory analytics to be able to show them and back it up with data about where they may or may not be hitting that target and how to analyze that for themselves. So basically teaching them a different way to look at their business. And then there was a capabilities assessment of the tools that they were using to do this work with in-house, and did they have any gaps that needed to be filled in. And then finally taking that and building out a roadmap of what should come as like short, midterm, quick win activities versus more long-term transformational tools and selections and other larger process or organizational shifts that would have to help them long-term achieve transformational benefits.
As a tie-in to the analytics piece in terms of the assortment that Marty was mentioning, one of the benefits of meeting with a lot of the different players on the inventory management cycle for them is we were able to consolidate some of the information that may have been a little bit siloed around order quantities, around weeks of supply. And one of the deliverables that we provided was basically a look using their own data at their weeks of supply, what they currently own, and what the target should be based on how quickly they can replenish in their lead times. And I was able to illustrate that without impacting any in-store inventory, that they could have a significant reduction in how much they're carrying, because a lot of that inventory is sitting in the DCs. And as Marty had mentioned earlier, with the frequency of deliveries that they have, having that extra inventory in the store, you could reduce that without impacting the guest experience. And I think that was really telling and gave them some really definable targets early in that process.
To Mike's point, they wouldn't believe it unless we could prove it with the data. And so that analytics dashboard was really critical to us being able to prove it out to them and show them that not one guest is going to have to be disappointed by reducing this overall position.
So I know theme park visitors twofold. One, a lot of them are coming in from out of town, and sometimes internationally or wherever, many times on a plane. So if they were out of stock on something, was there any kind of buy online, ship to home capabilities? Do they do that? Or is it the instant gratifier? I have to have this stuffed animal, shirt, hat, whatever it is, while I walk out of the theme park because I want to use it right now. What were their feelings on that?
That's a really good question, actually, because we did talk about that a lot, and there isn't an online option when you're in a theme park type situation. So the majority of that you have to buy. That's the sense of urgency, right? That's why they can really operate in a full price environment too. It's an experiential thing. And so if you don't get it now, you've kind of missed your opportunity. They obviously will ship. So the range of items is mind-numbing that they could sell. So some items you don't want to carry around a park, or you may not be able to get back on a plane. They will ship to home for you from the park, and those options are available. But if it's out, it's out. There aren't a lot of opportunities for you to get something that you missed out on. And so that was an additional driving factor in that kind of persistence of, we can't let a single person be disappointed if they don't get their first choice, even though I would argue that sometimes people are okay with their second choice too, and there's some swing in that kind of perception. But that was a big hurdle to have that conversation.
As you see people walk around a theme park or get back on the plane or that type of thing, or not be able to take product X on a plane because of whatever requirements. So that's curious. What do you think would be the most impactful factor contributing to the success of the project?
It's the acknowledgement that the data is telling the story. It really is. Again, we talk about a few times that the culture is ingrained, and they have a very specific way of thinking that has been very successful for many, many years. But as the value of inventory management is increasing, and it becomes important for every organization, regardless of how successful they are in selling the product, it is a huge investment in really understanding that you can do the same amount of business with less, and being able to show that numerically is important. I think that's the piece that is critical to making the changes that would make that happen. One of the benefits, I think, with this particular project was the data that was made available early in the process was robust and very, very complete. That is not always the case. We know that data is king and is not always in such the shape that you can do those type of analytics in a short time span. But the timeliness of the data and the completeness of the data made the analytics possible, which was very important.
And that's what I was going to say about the success factors. For this organization, the high level of engagement from the client was incredible. It was really an amazing group to work with. And I know it seems like I should say that all the time, but it's not always true. This group really was great to work with. And particularly from a data, as Mike's saying, we didn't have to ask twice. As soon as we had a request in, I think typically the very next day we had it in our hand. And so sometimes we might have to wait weeks to get a request like that. And certainly in the volume that we asked for, all the way down to a location SKU level. And that just wasn't the case. We had everything in our hands from day one, and we're able to hit the ground running. Even on the on-site visits, the amount of engagement and support and commitment to the vision of what they were trying to do. Sometimes you'll have this difference of vision and energy of what's important to someone who is maybe back of house versus front of house. But I think there was a good alignment about, we all want to succeed, and it's a very ingrained culture there that everybody is on the same team to some degree, and just the engagement was incredible. The other piece that I would tag on to that is that the way they trusted us to be a part of their process. So we were allowed to sit in some of their large strategy and business meetings just as an observer to get an understanding of how their cross-functional teams work together, from envisioning their assortment strategies to even how they worked with the stores and locations, how they managed their open to buy process, just to give us the trust to sit in those and kind of be a fly on the wall and take notes and give feedback on that. Their openness to that feedback was really good. So, that's always a success factor. If you have someone that enters in from a defensive position, and even though they say they want this, but really the top leadership isn't on board, that's always a non-starter, and that's a big hurdle to get over. I didn't feel that so much. I felt like everyone was really highly engaged, ready to roll their sleeves up and jump in. And what's the first thing we need to do? And let's get on it. Let's get started. So that made a huge difference to me.
I would agree. And I would just reiterate, we talked to a wide range of cross-functional areas, from finance to DC operations, to store operations, to allocation. Every single one of them was extremely committed, understood exactly what the intent of the project was, and was willing to share and dive in and really roll up the sleeves and get the work done. So totally agree, Marty. It was top to bottom. There was not one instance where it wasn't that way.
Yeah, good data and good people. They've got their analysis of their inventory, their merchandising, and they've got a roadmap now. What are their next steps?
Get started. So, we're still in touch with them. And so they're basically using the roadmap as a guide. They adopted our kind of short-term, mid-term quick wins, and they've already started on those. They're already doing some pre-work on some of the long-term, like tool acquisition and selection processes. So, like I said, they were highly engaged and bought in. So they've already kind of started that. So understanding, like Mike was giving some anecdotal conversation earlier about our direction for what they could cut back on or how they could improve their inventory position without endangering that in-store experience. They've already started on that process, taking those recommendations, putting them into action, building out their plans in such a way that they can start ratcheting some of that down based on the layout and the roadmap that we gave them. Even on the dashboarding that Mike was talking about, where we did analytics, they've got their BI team on replicating what we did because they liked the way that we were looking at it, and they adopted that as a business practice. They understood the value and how we were trying to get them to change their perspective, and they've started rebuilding those dashboards in-house so that they can continue that type of analytics and approach. That's exactly what they're doing. They're on their path right now, so that roadmap's working out.
That's awesome. I was going to ask if they were going to kind of do a revisit of the merchant analytics on a regular basis to see, okay, we used to be here and now we're here, and what, rinse and repeat.
They have a very talented business intelligence team there. We sat with them and did some knowledge transfer and demonstrated what we were doing, how we did it, and set up the dashboards. I think the week after we finished the project, they were already heavily into we got to get this stood up. Nice. And we need to replicate what you were doing. Our management liked the way you approached it, and they want us to do the same. And they were bought in.
Very cool. So inventory obviously is a huge deal, especially with all the stuff going on in the world. What advice would you give other retailers faced with what may seem like insurmountable inventory challenges? Obviously, this was a unique client because of the theme parks, because of the very tailored assortments. Where should they start? Where would you point them?
To our website. No, seriously, I feel like I say this every time, but don't be afraid to get out of your box and take a fresh look at how you're managing that business. And yes, this organization, I think Mike said it earlier, that they had done things a particular way for a long period of time and have been very successful. But sometimes just having an outside perspective come in to give you a different look at it, and like how we developed for them to do that analysis or how to determine what those targets should be. It just sparks some new methodologies or some aha moments, which are really the most rewarding part when you see that in their eye where they go, I get it now. That is pretty sharp. I would even say I learned stuff from it doing the project. The way we switched how we were looking at productivity, I'm taking back to general retailers too. I still think it's a better methodology that's more consistent regardless of your business model, more so, right? And so that analytics toolkit that we were using and what we developed, I think could help anyone. I learned from every client, just like they learned from me. And that's something that I took away to help us build out our IP and what we can bring to other clients. Just take that first step, get a different set of eyes on it, and don't be afraid to change something or challenge the status quo. Even if it is working, at least take the opportunity to say, could we make it just one notch better? Is there something else we could do?
Yeah. I think that the time to really look at inventory is before you really, really need to. Usually at that point, it's too late or difficult to react. Data is everything. Understand your data, understand what it's telling you. And if you don't know the best way to do that, reach out to the experts and people that can help you get through the data. Usually data collection is not the problem. Data utilization is more the problem. So it's understanding what the inventory data tells you, understanding the components that impact inventory. Lead times can be highly volatile, especially in this day and age. And what impact does that have on those inventory values? So I think it's just understanding the data that you have and how to interpret what it's showing.
With the merchandise intelligence toolkit, if somebody says, hey, that sounds interesting, I love these results, what's the time frame? So we have a conversation with a retailer and they provide some data. How soon would we be able to help them understand what this data is telling them using the merchandising analytics toolkit?
So the analytics toolkit, it's usually in relation to a slightly larger project, but that toolkit and dashboard, we typically try to get stood up within about, say, 4 weeks.
Okay. Within the scope of a larger capabilities assessment. Yeah.
Yeah. But certainly if they're a smaller company, they don't have the strong BI teams or the technical capability to run those for themselves. We can host that for them. If we want to set it up for them and provide that access for them, we can set that up a subscription and we can run that for them. So we can help them on an ongoing basis if that's a need.
Very good. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on Talk Retail to Me and discussing the project. It's always very interesting, and I love being able to be a fly on the wall in y'all's projects every once in a while. So I appreciate it, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much.
That's a wrap for this episode of Talk Retail to Me. If you have questions related to today's topic, please visit our website at parkeravery.com to learn more and to contact us. Also, we'd love it if you shared Talk Retail to Me with any of your colleagues. It's streaming on all the major podcast platforms, and the videos are available on our YouTube channel. For more Parker Avery industry expertise and advice, be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.